So good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. So lots of people saying where they're from. So we've got Ecuador, Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, Estonia, Lithuania, from the US, India, so all over the world. Perfect. Italy, Iran. Hi, everyone. Perfect. So nice to have you all here. Thank you for joining today. So today's webinar is about how to teach engaging classes for exam success. So we'll be looking at Gold Experience second edition in particular, and what resources it offers teachers to help their students work towards their exams and hopefully achieve exam success. So we'll also look at some skills and techniques we can use as teachers to provide motivating lessons, both online and in the classroom, wherever you're teaching at the moment, and ways to adapt typical exam tasks as well, just to make them more enjoyable and varied for students, to just keep that motivation and engagement in our lessons. So just a few housekeeping points before we get started. So this webinar is being recorded and you'll be able to find it online straight after the session. And you'll also receive a certificate, a personalised certificate for attending the webinar within 3 days to your email inbox, and a virtual goodie bag with some nice surprises in there as well to help with your teaching. So many of you have already said where you're from, so welcome to everyone. But what exams do you teach? So if you can just write in the chat box, is it FCE B2, is it C1 Advanced, IELTS, or is it something different? So I'll just give you a moment. So we've got lots of FCE and CAE coming up. We've also got C2 proficiency, advanced IELTS, lots of IELTS, the CET coming up as well, IGCSE, FCE. Perfect. So a lot of B1, B2 sort of coming up here as well. We've got business English. Perfect. So we're not going to focus on one exam in particular in this webinar. We'll be talking about techniques and skills that hopefully we can adapt to use for different exams as well. So it's great to have everyone here. Thank you so much for joining wherever you are. So just a little bit about me. My name is Billie and I now work as a freelancer. So I teach, I write materials, do teacher training as well. And I've been teaching for around 8 years, the past 8 years in China, Italy, Spain, and in the UK in Cambridge, where I'm now based. So I've mainly been teaching exam classes to lots of different age groups. So from teenagers right up into adults, and some business English as well. And again, mostly focusing on FCE, B2, CAE and CPE exams, as well as IELTS. I write materials for some well-known course books and apps, including Gold Experience, which we'll touch on later today. If anyone does have any questions throughout the webinar, please do ask them at the end. We'll have a designated time for that. But if you do have any questions throughout, or do have any tips or strategies that you want to share with other teachers, please do feel free to add them into the chat box as well, so we can share them. Okay, so let's get started. So first of all, let's look at student motivation. So I think whether we're in exam classes or regular classes, I think as teachers, student motivation might be one of the biggest obstacles to overcome. So that might be because of the student's extrinsic motivation, so external factors for them learning English. So that could be something like workplace requires them to learn English, or their parents are telling them they must learn English, for example. Or the student's intrinsic motivation, so their personal reasons for learning. And I think it's important for us as teachers to find out why students are studying for the exam at the beginning of our course if we can, just so we can sort of find out why they're learning, and then we can use that to personalise the lessons and help keep them engaged and interested in them as well. So what are some of the reasons that you think students might become demotivated during their exam classes? So I've just got the question here for you. So I'll just give you a moment to write your answers in the chat box. Yeah, so Liz said boring exam practice. Marjorie as well, boring. Repetitive tasks, which someone mentioned, yeah. Difficult texts, no personal interest. Exam anxiety, difficulty. Yeah, the plateau effect, exactly. John said they don't find it interesting. Absolutely. I think exam tasks do tend to have a repetitiveness to them, especially things like the B2 and the C1. The use of English can be quite boring, and the students might become disengaged. Yeah, so a lot of information to process as well. Yeah, so lots of good ideas coming through. So here are some of the things that I thought about. So firstly, in a real life classroom, maybe the behaviours of others is just generally distracting. So that could cause them to become disengaged in the lesson. Secondly, maybe the student has been placed in the wrong class initially, which means it might be too easy or too difficult, and therefore this might link back to the behavioural issues we mentioned as well. Next, I think the extrinsic motivation of the student might lead them to being less engaged. So maybe they're just learning, as we said, because of the parents or the workplace want them to, or they're just studying so they can get that qualification that they need rather than something they actually want for themselves. Maybe a lack of understanding, as some of you have mentioned in the chat box as well. A lack of understanding could be in the exam itself, could be in individual parts, or could be of the level of English in general. So this goes back to the placement issues. Maybe we haven't sort of figured out what level they should be in. Maybe they're in the wrong class, which then might lead to those behavioural issues as well. And as a lot of you mentioned as well, another factor might be repetitiveness. So from doing the same task over and over again in the same way, or maybe students grow tired of practicing solely for the exam. They find it boring to do the same sort of thing over and over again. And as teachers, we can't really help it because we have to teach them and sort of lead them towards passing their exam. So we need to try and come up with dynamic ways that we can teach each part. And finally, I think some students need the exam, maybe for university, for example, and they also want to learn English, but they don't see the relationship or the correlation between how they can use that exam English in the real world or outside of the classroom. But English is English, so it can be used practically inside and outside of the classroom, but maybe students sort of struggle to find the relationship between those two things. So I think as teachers, we need to think about how can we overcome these things in general. So first, we're going to look at repetitiveness and how we can try and make sure that we're adding that variation to our classes, to the task types as well, just by differentiating the way that we deliver them and teach them. And then later we'll look at how to do this using different audio, video and interactive tools and games in the class with Gold Experience 2nd edition in particular, and then how the online resources can also help provide differentiation as well. So let's break it down into the 4 skills, as all exams generally cover all of these 4 skills. So first of all, let's look at speaking. So we've got 2 different activities here. So on the left, we've got activity idea 1. So in the first activity, we put students into small groups and we can give them either a whole speaking test or part of a speaking test, for example. And this is sort of asking students to simulate a real life speaking exam, but recording themselves on their phones. So we just need to make sure students are recording themselves just so we don't come under fire for any privacy issues or things like that. So each student records themselves speaking or maybe answering exam questions. Maybe to ease them in, they could try part 1 of a speaking exam, which is generally getting to know you questions and finding a little bit about yourself. So maybe start with something that students would feel comfortable with. So the students record themselves speaking or answering those questions, and then we can encourage them to reflect on their speaking by asking them to look back, watch it back, and find 3 things they did well and 3 things that they need to improve on. So to do this, we can hand out the marking scheme, which we'll have a look at a little bit later on. So the marking scheme for the speaking exam. And then you can ask students to base their own personal reflection on this criteria. So this might be things such as pronunciation, hesitation and utterances like and things like that. Or it could be the structure of their sentences, or the type of vocabulary that they use as well, whether they repeat or use sort of high frequency words. And then the second activity we have on the right here is a sort of speed dating style activity, which I'm sure many of you have used sort of a variation of in your class at some point. So you set up the class so the students are facing each other, and then you can assign the students as A and B. And then this will work better if all of the students on the interior of the class are the same letter, and all the students on the exterior are the same letter as well. So let's say B's on the inside and A's on the outside. So that just makes it easier for us to sort of monitor when we're asking students to move around. So we can give students a speaking exam, or parts of a speaking exam. Again, sort of introduce it with the first part. And then we get A's to act as the examiner, and they ask the part 1 questions to their B partner, who acts as the candidate. So we can ask them to think about one thing that the candidate does well and one thing that they think they could improve. Again, you can use that marking criteria if you like as well. And then as teachers, of course, we need to monitor, and then we can note down any errors that we hear during the activity itself. So then we can later do delayed error correction, or we can note down sort of similar mistakes that we hear the students are making to make it feel sort of more personalised feedback at the end as well. So those are 2 activity ideas there for speaking. And if you do know any other ways to practice speaking exam tasks, please do feel free to share them in the chat box for others to try as well. And hello to everybody who's just joining as well. And we've just covered speaking. Let's move on to listening. So some exam tasks. So many of you said the IELTS that you're focusing on at the beginning there. In the IELTS, students are asked to listen for specific information, such as telephone numbers or spellings of surnames, for example, that are spelt out to them. So students might think, oh, how can I practice this? Because it seems like such a simple thing to do, but it can be quite confusing. For example, in British English, we use O in a phone number, and then in American English, they would use 0, for example. So in order to practice this, we can get students to set up a conference call, could be Skype or Zoom or whichever online platform you want to suggest to them. And they can add their classmates as well. So they can work in pairs and add their pair. So you could do this as homework, or if you are still doing online classes, this is excellent to do in sort of a breakout room without the video. Or if you're in school, you can do it in a selected computer class slot as well. So ask students to call each other, get them to turn off the video so they're not distracted, they are just listening, and get them to tell each other a story or a description of something that's happened to them, and then get their partner to listen. So it could be, for example, a TV show that they've watched, or a film, or an album they've listened to, for example, or maybe even something that they've bought at the shop recently. So you can get students to listen and write a summary of what their partner has said. So again, that practices listening and writing skills. Or you can get them to write down specific information, so spelt correctly, such as song names or characters, for example. Or even if they are talking about shopping, get them to write down some of the prices that they've mentioned. And then you can feedback on that in the next class by asking students to share what they've heard from their partner as well. And then on the right-hand side here, we've got some more activity ideas. So you can print out song lyrics and do a gap fill or sentence completion. And again, this is really useful because you can either do one lexical set, or you could do sort of a grammar structure or phrasal verbs, as I know some of you mentioned that there's a lot of phrasal verbs in many of the exams. So you could find a song and remove the phrasal verbs and get them to listen that way. Another good website is lyricstraining.com. So here you can enhance the difficulty, or you can make it easy depending on the level of your class. And it's similar to printing out the lyrics and doing a gap fill yourself, except here they're watching the video, listening to the song, and have to type in the words. So you can get students to come to the front to do that, get them to do it for homework, or even do it as a whole class as well. Also, we've got here in our third bullet point, playing scenes from authentic series. So I think authentic material is absolutely crucial in keeping students engaged in the lessons, because then they can relate that language to the real world outside of the classroom as well. So you can play a scene, for example, from a series, even a clip from a film. There's a very good website called filmenglish.com as well, which you could use. You could create listening comprehension questions such as gap fill activities, or again, get them to make notes and write a summary of what they've seen as well. Now, when it comes to writing, I think we may tend to just give sort of essay tasks or articles or reviews, for example, and get them to write full pieces, which can be tedious for sort of the teacher to mark, but also for the students tend to sort of groan when they get a writing task. So if we don't want to give them a whole writing piece, how can we incorporate writing practice into our classes? So how do you practice writing for exams without asking students to write a full piece? So I'll give you a moment just to write your answers in the chat box there. Okay, so someone said writing sentences. Yeah, brainstorming as well with key phrases. Brainstorming is good to elicit vocabulary and also maybe sort of lexical chunks as well. Micro writings, yeah, jigsaw, yeah, copying from a text, okay. Padlet, yeah, using online resources is really good for practicing writing as well. As Naomi said, collaborative writing. I think that's something that we don't really think about too much as teachers. We just assume that students need to work independently for writing, whereas actually we can get them to work in pairs and work in groups. And then we can encourage that peer learning, which is really important as well. Okay, so we've got journals, short essays, starting with brainstorming. And as Radhika said, paragraph writing, absolutely. Just getting them to write one paragraph just to make sure they've got an introduction perfectly written, for example, or perfectly written according to their level or the structure. Okay, perfect. So let's have a look at some ideas which I've actually tried in class. So here I've put on the left something to help us with essay writing. So I think essays are something which are really important, as for example in the B2 and C1 exam, it's something that you have to write in part 1 of writing. You can't avoid it. So getting the essay structure down is really, really important for students. And of course, in different countries around the world, essays might be structured quite differently. So we need to make sure that we're doing it according to what's expected of them in that particular exam. So on the left here, we can put students into groups of 4, give them each a different topic, and we can have student A work on the introduction, B on the second paragraph, student C on the third, so the negatives or disadvantages, for example, if you're writing an opinion essay, and student D on the conclusion. So as they'll have different topics, each group will have different topics, not the 4 students. Their ideas will be different, sort of going around the classroom. And then it's sort of easier just to monitor each group, because then they've all got sort of a different task that you can keep them motivated with, and you can recycle this activity as well. So go through the structure of an essay first, find out what each paragraph is likely to contain. So you could do that by giving an essay and eliciting what is in each paragraph. So for example, the introduction, then introducing your positive points, if it's an opinion essay, negative points, and then summarizing overall at the bottom. So once they've written their paragraph, the students then pass it on to the next person in the group, and then they continue with that. So once it's been passed around 4 times, there'll be a full essay and a good opportunity to give peer feedback and encourage the peer learning from what their group member has written. You could also do it so each member in the group has a different topic, so they are writing about something different in each paragraph as well, just to get their mind going and to elicit some different vocabulary from them as well. Then on the right here, it's quite good to practice stories, which often appears in some exams as well. So you give each student a piece of paper and you ask them to draw a face. They don't have to be a great artist, just any face at the top of their piece of paper. And then you ask students to give the character a name and to write 5 adjectives to describe their appearance and 5 adjectives to describe their personality. You can also get them to write 5 adjectives to describe a place as well, if you think that will help them, and if you intend on your story discussing the place as well. So you can give your class an opening sentence to the story. So in my example here, I've put, "It was a cold, dark night and." Then we can ask students to write the character's name. So for example, Simon. So it was a cold, dark night and Simon. And then we tell them to write "was," and then they complete the sentence. So then they pass the story to the next student on their left, for example. They add the next sentence and so on around the class. So they're coming up with quite a creative and imaginative story there. You could also then finish by having sort of a little book club where students read the stories aloud, especially if you've given them sort of a humorous introduction to their story. Or you could get them to walk around the room and read them, then take a class vote on the best and the most imaginative one or the funniest one, for example. So again, if you do have any other ideas for others to use to do writing activities in their exam classes, please just do feel free to write them in the chat box as well. So the final skill that we haven't mentioned yet is reading. So again, I've used a couple of these in my classes myself, and they do work really well and just sort of get students moving a little bit, particularly in the first activity. So this activity is designed to help students practice finding keywords, which are really crucial in any type of reading activity. So you can give groups or pairs of students different texts. So it's really important that we have different texts for each group. So we get them to read it, maybe for gist, and to find the keywords that they see in their text once they've looked at it. Or they can write down any keywords in the questions if you prefer to focus on the questions. So you ask them to write those keywords on a piece of paper, get them to screw it up into a ball, and then have them stand up and throw it up into the air. So they can throw it behind them, in front of them, wherever they want to, because it's only a piece of paper, so it won't hurt anybody. So then you can ask groups to go and collect one, then have them try and piece together what they think the text is about from the keywords on their piece of paper. So this is really, really useful as it sort of builds up the gist of a story without them reading the whole text. Because often students think, oh, when it comes to looking for gist, I tend to read the text very quickly, but actually they can just look for keywords. And I think this exercise sort of helps them realise that. And they tend to react well to this sort of activity because they're allowed to make a mess in the classroom as well without us moaning about it. And it sort of works for any age as well. Then in activity 2 here, we've got something which requires mini whiteboards if you do have access to them. So you can hand out texts to group or pairs and then ask comprehension questions such as true or false, which might work well with these mini whiteboards. And then you can set a time, could be a visible time, which might help students. Then they can scan the text and write their answers on the mini whiteboards, count 3, 2, 1, have them show their answers, and then you can award points for answers that have been correctly found. So again, that just adds a bit of competitiveness and something different in the classroom as well. So students haven't just got their heads down into their books. Finally, we've got a timed scanning task, which often works well in class as well. So you hand out a text to individual students and ask them to scan the text to find specific words related to that topic. So for example, if the text is about the world of work, you could ask them to find maybe as many jobs as they can in 3 minutes, or some statistics related to jobs depending on the level of the class as they can in 3 minutes as well, or whatever time you think is appropriate. So do have the timer visible, or have a look a little bit later on at where you can find one online, just so students are aware of the time as well, because they will need timed exam practice and get used to those times as well. So you can get students to stand up or raise their hands when they have their answers, and you can award points if you want to make it sort of competitive as well. So the second 2 tasks work well online, but the first would need to be one in a classroom setting. Okay, so also some of you mentioned at the beginning you're teaching CAE, CPE, maybe FCE exams as well. So because we are all teaching different exams, I thought I'd touch briefly here on the use of English paper, which appears in the B2 first and the C1 advanced. So if you're teaching a Cambridge exam, or you have in the past, you'll know that the use of English is not fun, I would say probably at all, to practice. Students find it quite repetitive, quite tedious, and because it is heavily grammar and vocabulary based, students wonder sort of where to pluck that knowledge from, and there's no sort of context or topic related context around it. So here's a good way to practice a part 2 or part 4 of the use of English. So that's the open, close, or the sentence transformation, as we have an example of here. So you put students into small groups, cut up the use of English paper. So if you can photocopy one from a student's book, for example, print one off online. So you cut up, for example, with this task, the individual items, so 1 to 6. So you set a time for them to work through these as a group, and this would work really well if you set the groups up in a circle sort of formation around the classroom, and you can stand in the middle just to monitor. So you ask students to hold up their answers once they have them, and then you award points for the correct answers, or you can shake your head or check that one, sort of gesture to them if there's something that still needs work. And this is a competitive activity, so you can sort of get a bit of exercise, having a look at what the students are doing as well, and then award points on the board if you want to, and then announce the winning team as the team that completes either each part or both parts correctly first, depending on the level of your class. As Pamela said, you can paste them in slides now that you're in lockdown. Yeah, absolutely. You can do this online, definitely. In Zoom, for example, you could do breakout rooms. So you put pairs or groups of students into one room, and then you can send them either individual sentences, or you can send them the whole paper as well for use of English. And finally, a nice way to practice all 4 of the skills or all parts of the exam is to set up sort of a circuit style activity. So circuits in the respect of exercise. So when you go from station to station. So for example, one station might have listening, one might have reading, one might have writing, and then a use of English if that's in the exam that you're studying for, or you could have a grammar or vocabulary station if you prefer. So students complete one part of the exam. So it could be listening part 1, could be 1 paragraph of a writing, and it could be 1 reading text and 1 part of the use of English that you think students need to practice a little bit more. Once they've completed that, they move on to the next and the next and the next, and then they get a good chance to practice all sorts of different skills as well. You could have listening in the classroom, sort of on headphones, or if you're in a large classroom, that might work well. Or if you do have older students or students that you particularly trust, you could put them into another room, allow them to play it twice if you're doing a Cambridge exam, or play it once if you're doing an IELTS as well. So it's quite a nice way to introduce students to certain exam task types at the beginning of a course, but also to mix up the way that students practice them once they do feel a bit more confident in each paper as well. So if anyone does have any other ideas, please do feel free to write them in the chat box, just so we can share our ideas among everyone in the webinar as well. Okay, yeah, so some of you have said that you've actually tried the station. So yeah, it is a really interesting way of just seeing what students need to practice maybe at the beginning, or even halfway through a course when they have tried each paper and they think, oh, I'm not sure whether students need to practice the part 4 keyword transformation, sentence transformations, for example. So it's good at any part of the course. Okay, so now let's look at how we can use a course book and different resources that come with it, just to bring some dynamism to our lessons and continue that engagement with the students as well. So we're going to be looking at Gold Experience 2nd edition. So there are lots and lots of online resources you can use with Gold Experience. So if you could just write in the chat box if you do use this as your course book at the moment, or if you're intending on using it maybe when you go back into schools or at some point in the future. So I'll just give you a moment to write in the chat box. So Liz said she uses it for B2. Yeah, someone else said B1. Jose said he uses it for B1, C1. Miriam loves the Gold series. That's great. Me too, because it's got so many resources on there. You don't need to supplement either. So, okay. So A2, B1. So lots of you are using the Gold Experience books. That's excellent. So hopefully you'll be familiar with it. So let's just have a look at how we can use it to add some variation to the classroom as well. So with the online resources, you can project them at the front of your real life classroom if you are in the classroom, or you can share your screen on Zoom or Skype, for example, in your conference call. So I recently did a webinar on accessing the different materials for Gold Experience, which you can find a recording of on YouTube if you missed it. So just search for how to teach online with Gold Experience and the recording will come up if you need help logging in, and just a reminder of how to use different resources as well. So firstly, the student's book. It provides ample practice of the exam. So each level is focused around a different exam. So for example, the A2 course book works towards Key for Schools, B1 for the preliminary exam. The B2 course book works towards the FCE first exam, and the C1 towards the CAE advanced exam as well. So here you can see all of the exams that each level works towards. So the skills learned in these course books are useful for the exam, but are also transferable to the real world outside of the classroom because they're topic-based units. And it's also transferable to other exams as well, such as the PTE, the Pearson Test of English, and of course, practicing the 4 main skills is useful for any exam, so IELTS, for example. So all of the levels work towards the ultimate goal of helping students develop the technical skills they need for the exam tasks, while focusing on the process of the exam as well. And the course is based on a combination of exam requirements and the global scale of English for the learning objectives as well, so the GSE. So the coursebook provides plenty of practice of those 4 main skills. And at the beginning of each unit is a unit overview, which tells you which exam tasks you'll be covering in each unit, so you can better prepare and plan your lessons. And there's also a grammar and vocabulary section in each unit, as well as 2 use of English spreads for levels B2 and above as well. So it also provides extra activities to help in areas that students often feel most nervous about. So there's extra practice in there. So this could be speaking, listening, or writing shorter pieces as well that we mentioned earlier, for example. So let's have a look at a unit. So the spreads can help you prepare your students for the exam. So for example, the vocabulary and grammar sections, as you can see here, they help learners develop their range with topic-related units. They apply to both exam tasks and, again, as we're talking about that engagement outside of the classroom as well. So this topic here is about the world of work and education. So, for example, in speaking part 1, as we said earlier, of most exams, it's getting to know you questions. So students might have to talk about their education, their qualifications, and their workplace, or what they do for a living, for example. So the topic-related units really do work both inside and outside of the classroom, because students would actually need to talk about that in a real-life situation as well. So these examples come from the B2 course book. Next, we'll look at the exam tasks. So they're introduced in a graded way quite early on in the course and earlier in the first couple of units. So it might mean a task with fewer questions or a shorter text to help them deal with it more effectively initially. And then students can build up to full exam tasks. Throughout the book, there's also useful exam tips, as you can see in the bottom left here. So over time, exam tasks will become easier for students, which is what we want as teachers. And it's also really helpful for teachers as well, because if students ask us for a particular tip or strategy for that particular exam task and we can't think of something off the top of our heads, we can refer them to that and say, oh, this is a very useful tip that you can use as well. There's also model answers, which are provided for both writing and speaking, which often we don't find model answers for speaking in course books. So students can know what's expected of them at their level, and this will help them know sort of what content and language to include in their answers, both written and speaking. So these can also be found in the exam file at the back of the student's book, as well as online in the resource pack. So it's helpful for teachers because you have something to compare students' writing to, and then students can use it as a base of how they're supposed to be writing at their level. And if they're not sort of at that level, they can use it as something to work towards. You can analyze it as a class. You can look through grammar structures or vocabulary. And then if a similar topic comes up, they've already got some ready-made vocabulary that they can use from the model answer. It also helps you as a teacher if you're not particularly familiar with the structure or content of a certain style of writing. So an article, for example, or as we mentioned earlier, essays they tend to be different in different countries around the world. So it's particularly useful for us to analyse each paragraph and just elicit from the students what's actually included in the structure and how we can cohesively organise our opinions and ideas as well. So the model answers for speaking are also provided as a listening, or we could give out the audio script as well, which we could use as sort of a reading practice too. So online resources. So there's lots and lots of digital resources that come with Gold Experience. And this helps us provide some interactivity into our lessons and something visual for students as well, rather than just sort of looking down at their course book all the time. So before we have a look at the online resources, can you just write in the chat box if you have used the Pearson online portal before? So I'll just give you a moment. Okay, so we've got about 50-50. Some people saying yes, some people saying no. Some people saying they've just started using it or they might use it in the future. And just says he hasn't used it, but now he will. Excellent. So we'll have a look at some of the resources that you can use as well. Okay, yes, it's about 50-50, but I think the majority said, yeah, they do use the online resources. Perfect. Florencia, it's your first time, so this would be great. So you can see what you can access on there and how you can use it in the classroom. So as I said before, if you are struggling to log on, or if you're thinking, oh, I'm not really sure how to access it, if your course books are digital ready, do feel free to have a look at the previous webinar that I did. Just gives you a bit more information about logging on, how to access it, and how you can utilize it best as well with your students. Okay, so if you log on to your portal and click on resources, you're able to access your print coursebook and workbook and lots of other material to help students work towards their exam, as you can see here. So each box is a different resource. So we have links to audio, to video, to grammar presentations, answer keys, and so on. And the grammar presentations are excellent because they're ready-made PowerPoint presentations you can download. Saves you writing the form and the use on the board, for example, and you can just sort of go through it with students if you aren't keen on a particular grammar point or don't feel strong yourself. There are ready-made grammar presentations on there as well. So once you've logged in, you can access the resources section. So here is an example of the assessment package that it comes with. So there's diagnostic tests, unit tests, review tests, and placement tests, among many other tests, to make sure that your students are in the right class, which again increases that motivation just to make sure that we do have a class that is sort of more or less the same level. And yeah, just making sure that motivation can stay high by students being placed correctly. There's also a full exam practice booklet and a real life exam video, which shows the full speaking exam, as you can see a clip from in the middle here. And it also shows you the examiner feedback, and we have the audio script of the exam too. There's also a video with answers to frequently asked questions and a full script and audio for 2 full tests as well. So a nice activity I like to do with the speaking video is to hand out the marking scheme, which can be found easily online. Just type in the name of your exam with marking scheme. And this is the example of the B2 first marking scheme here. So you put students into pairs or groups and allocate them one of the headers. So for example, one group could focus on grammar and vocabulary, the second group on discourse management, the third on pronunciation, and the final on interactive communication. So you have them watch the video and then get them to mark the speakers according to how they think the speakers did. So for example, if the discourse management group thinks the student had very little hesitation, clear organisation, good structure of ideas, they may score the student in the video a 4 or 5, for example. If they think they didn't do so well, maybe something lower, such as a 2 or 3, or potentially even a 1. So you can ask them to explain their reasons why, which helps them practice their speaking and also listening skills for the other students as well. And you can ask them to think of ways that they think the candidates could have improved. And then hopefully this will build their confidence in helping them know what to expect in their exam, because they can see the exam and can put themselves in that position. So it can also help to build sort of a whole class discussion, particularly if there's disagreements on how they think the candidates did. So for example, if you have 8 groups in the class, you'll have 2 talking about grammar and vocabulary, 2 on discourse management, and so on. And those 2 groups might have opposing views or differing views that you could then turn into sort of a mini debate or a whole class discussion as well, using the marking criteria to help them. So as I said, this can easily be found online if you just search. Has anyone tried an activity like this or anything using the marking criteria before? You can just write in the chat box. Yeah, so most people have used it. So Pamela said no, never. I think it's quite useful for students to see the marking criteria for speaking, maybe even writing as well, so that they have something that they can say, oh, I want to do this because I want to achieve this level. And it's particularly useful in IELTS, which is marked on a graded band system as well. So students often need a 6.5 to 7.5, so they can see exactly what's required of them as well. Giovanna said, yeah, she's used it for writing. As I said, it works perfectly for writing as well. Okay, so we also have a presentation tool on the Pearson portal as well. So this can be shown at the front of the class or can be shared online with your students if you are teaching online, just by sharing the screen on your conference call. So here you can access the full student's book and go through it in a full page view, like on the left here, or on the right, activity by activity. So you can focus on these activities by clicking the yellow icons next to each one, as you can see in the full page view here. So this just makes classes more interactive and also provides something visual for those visual learners, rather than just simply looking at the course book and going through each page. Students are actually able to see something in front of them and work as a whole class or in groups and pairs as well. So you can also access teaching tools through your presentation. Again, these bring a bit of dynamism to the class, maybe even some competitiveness as well. So we have a timer, which we can see on the right here, and this can be used to time exam tasks. So it's a good visible timer for students to be aware, especially with writing, for their planning stages and the full writing stages. And there's also a team point counter as well, which we can see on the left. This could be used to give points to students to find errors in the article, for example, maybe with the cut up use of English activity that we looked at earlier. And any number of teams can be added to the scoreboard. So here I've just got 2, but you can add 3, 4, 5, as many as you have in your class, for example. We also have lots and lots of teaching tools here, and there's lots of resources on the Pearson online portal to help you teach engaging classes for your students, and lots of opportunities for students to engage in different ways rather than just looking at our course books. So I think it appeals to different learner types, as we said, by providing visuals there and audio for auditory learners as well, among lots and lots of other resources such as the grammar presentations. So if you, for example, with the teaching tools here, if you're struggling to think of a definition for a word, there's also a dictionary that you can bring up for the students, type in a word or get them to type in the word to practice spelling and bring up the definition as well. So another thing that is really important when we're teaching exam classes, especially now many of us are teaching online, is independent learning. So this is sort of based around goal setting, encouraging students to become more autonomous as well. So a question for you guys: why do you think encouraging independent learning is important, and why do you think it might be motivating for students? So why is it important and why is it motivating? I'll just give you a moment to write your ideas in the chat box. Okay, so Matilda said nowadays it's crucial. Yeah, Ezra said for self-confidence. Manuela said for their future. Okay, yeah, critical thinking, learning at their own pace. Christina said it's important for autonomy. Yeah, so students can sort of choose what activities they want to do and what else they need to practice as well. Self-confidence, they can study what they like. Yeah, because they get their own personal interest skills improved. Absolutely, yeah, they can personalize the lesson or homework activities exactly for what they're interested in, for example. Yeah, Andres said autonomy as well. Violetta said motivating, absolutely. Barbara said autonomous individual learning helps students to learn how to solve problems and situations without scaffolding them. Yeah, exactly. So we don't want to handhold them all the time. We want students to sort of build on their own existing knowledge, and also it builds their confidence by seeing their progress and their reflections as well. Okay, so to me, it means students are able to monitor their own progress so that they can see what they need to improve on. And then that allows them to choose tasks to help them focus on their problem areas. So it develops students' creativity and intellectual curiosity. And research has shown that it does increase motivation, it builds their confidence, and it also allows students to recognise their own strengths and weaknesses as well by allowing them time for reflection and goal setting as well. So with Gold Experience, there are lots of opportunities for independent learning and ways to encourage students. So at the beginning of each unit, as you can see in the pink here, there are learner goals which describe can-dos for each skill at the beginning of each unit. So I think if students are able to know what the learning objective is, whether it's us writing aims on the board at the beginning of the lesson or referring them back to this unit overview at the beginning of each unit, it will be easier for them to reflect at the end of each lesson and decide whether they think they've achieved that or not. So I remember sort of teaching and not writing aims on the board, and I thought, why should I write the aims? Because I know the aims. But actually it's crucial for students, so then they can see if they've actually achieved what they want to, what they set out to do, and what you set to teach them at the beginning. At the end of each unit, there's also a section here on independent learning. So you can see that on the right-hand side here. So students can self-reflect, and there are opportunities for peer feedback as well, which again just encourages that autonomous learning. So students do generally like to learn from each other. And again, it sort of helps us out because we don't need to do the feedback for a change, and the students can sort of do peer feedback too. So you can also guide students towards the group projects to help students develop their decision-making skills and their creativity skills, which can be found in the switch-on sections at the end of each unit. So they're video lessons there, and there's a lot of pair work and group work opportunities. And in the workbook on the right, which we have an example of here, it provides extra practice of vocabulary, grammar, and different items that can be found in the students' book as well. So students can be guided towards using these as extra practice for things that they're finding difficult maybe, or to provide an extra challenge for those that need it. So you can direct students to one of those pages and get them to choose what activity they want to fulfill for their homework. So again, you're just giving them that option of choice. So some other ways to encourage independent learning. So we can ask students to set personal learning goals, which might be quite difficult early on, but the more you do it, the more students will get used to it. So this is sort of related to the fourth point as well, offering feedback on learning, because the more personalised feedback we give the students, the more they're able to understand what sort of areas they need to work on, whether that be skills or exam items or parts of an exam, for example. So we can help students set their personal learning goals, but as time goes on, we should encourage them to try and set their own. Then maybe feedback to us those, what they are, for example. So if they have done the recorded speaking that we spoke about earlier, or we've given them the marking criteria, they'll have something to base their learning goals on, rather than just saying, I need to improve my speaking. What areas of the speaking? Is it the cohesion in what you're saying, the organization of your arguments? So just giving them that marking criteria and allowing them to look back on themselves, as we said, with recording themselves is very useful. So we can also allow students to make decisions about their own learning. So this is in regards to lesson planning, but it also could be the extra activities or homework that we set, as we said with the workbook example. So, for example, we can offer different essay topics for students to choose from, Or we could tell students, for example, what our objectives are for the week. So we could say, oh, we really need to practice reading or listening for detail, for example. Then we can allow them to choose what they want to do on each day. So us as teachers, we have an idea in our mind of what we want to achieve that week, but it doesn't necessarily matter which order we do it in. Just give them the option and they'll feel like this is about me. I've made this decision and the whole class is sort of learning it based on what we want to do rather than the teacher telling us what we have to do. So they'll remember that the class is about them and not about us as teachers. And it will also reduce that teacher talking time as well, because students have chosen what they want to do. So hopefully they'll already have sort of a basis or an idea of what to expect when they come into the lesson. And the final point here is encouraging peer feedback, which I think is crucial in developing student independence, because it helps students develop their critical thinking skills and make evaluative judgments as well. So they're being social and practicing their oral English whilst reducing the amount of pressure that some students may feel when receiving teacher feedback, for example. So all students, whether it's their personality, whether it's their nationality, react to teacher feedback and teacher interaction in a different way. So I feel as though we need to give personalised feedback, but peer feedback is very, very useful because students might take it on board a bit better, might not feel as pressured or stressed with the teacher telling us what sort of errors there might be. If there's generic errors in the class that we need to fix, of course we can do that and still give personalised feedback. But I think just student-to-student interaction as well really, really helps. And then it builds that confidence rather than them thinking, the teacher's told me I'm wrong, for example. So if you can think of any other ideas to encourage independent learning, please do feel free to write them in the chat box to share with everyone. So we've touched on some ideas of ways to differentiate the different tasks and the 4 main skills as well. And we've had a look at the tools available to engage students in the lesson with gold experience. And we've also briefly looked at ways to motivate our exam students by encouraging independent learning. So we're coming close to the end of the webinar and we've got a bit of time for questions. But first of all, let me just remind you that this is part of Pearson English's Spring Days webinar series, which is running from the 4th of May to the 15th. And if you head over to english.com/spring days that you can see on the screen here, you'll find the registration for lots and lots of different webinars from various experts for primary, secondary, adult and assessment. Also, just a reminder that this webinar has been recorded and a link to the recording will be sent to you after the session. Within 3 days after the event, you'll receive a personalised certificate emailed out to you, as well as a virtual goodie bag with lots of exciting things inside as well. So before we go, we do have time for some questions. So I'll just give you a moment. If anyone does have any questions, please do feel free to write. So Anastasia said, while preparing FCECA CP, is it necessary to write summaries? I wouldn't say it's a requirement of the exam itself, but writing summaries is just a nice way to get them practicing short writing rather than whole pieces. So writing summaries of listening, for example, if you watch an authentic scene from a film or a TV program, for example, it practices listening skills, but it also practices writing. So writing summaries is a really nice way to get them to write short pieces of writing. Let's just see if we've got any other questions here. Can I access the online portal if I have the book? So the access to the online portal is on the inside front cover of the student's book or the teacher's book. And if you scratch off the code, that's how you access it on there. Audio material. You seem to run out of audio material, Andrea. So there's lots and lots and lots of audio material on the portal. So you've got all of the audio from the student's book, the workbook as well. And also you've got those full speaking tests on there, which you can use as listening. And don't forget, you can also use authentic things as well. So things maybe from the BBC, Channel 4, even from sort of channels from the USA, maybe something from the news, CNN, for example. Remember that you can use authentic sources for listening too. I think we've got time for one more question. Let's have a look here. Pamela said, can we use the book for 80-minute classes once a week? there's a lot of material in there that you can use for as little or as long as you like. So it depends obviously on the level of your class and how much reinforcement you need of those exam items and skills, for example. But you could use it once a week, you could use it twice a week, but you do have enough with the online resources to last you a very, very long time. Okay, so if we have any more questions, please just feel free to write them. If not, we have come to the end of the webinar. So if you enjoyed it, do feel free to give some feedback, and you can write about this on social media channels with hashtag Pearson Spring Days as well, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, for example. Thank you so much for attending today. Thank you so much for your interaction and your answers to the questions as well. And have a good day and take care wherever you are. Have a good afternoon, evening, or good day. Thanks, guys. Bye.